Hello. Hi, Madeline. Hello, friends. Hi, Maria, Deborah, Ben. Great to see folks. Hi, Kathleen from Texas. Nice to see some friends who used to be here in Portland and now are elsewhere. And so I've had a chance to know you in person and practice with you in person. And then nice to see so many folks joining in from different parts of the world. Anyone who's joined me in this platform before knows that I'm forever deeply inspired by this being a really great use of technology, a chance for worldwide connection and Sangha. So let's start with a sit, please. Begin this meditation by allowing the attention to explore your current moment definition of this body-mind. Meaning we're beginning with noticing whatever our habitual definition of that is. Perhaps I'm just feeling into my experience of these legs on this cushion, or this back leaning against this chair if you're in a seat. Allow the exploration to be tangible, grounded, relating to form. The form of this breath, the form of the chest rising, and falling, the form of hands perhaps resting on your legs or in your lap. Bring your attention to the brain. Just visualize the brain softening. And now allow the attention to expand. So the attention gently moving beyond this body. Attend to the room you're in. Allowing the attention to move into what surrounds you. Attending to the floor. To the walls. And just quietly attending to the objects in the room, whatever those objects might be. Now in your mind's eye, attend to what's beyond this room. Allow the attention to ripple outward, and just notice what happens without judgment as you do that. So for me in this moment, that means attending to the sound of the rain. The movement of my dogs downstairs. So consciously attending to what you aren't seeing. Yet what is known in experience. And now, without going to the head, without engaging thinking mind to the best of your ability, just notice how has this attending been happening. Through what means are these various objects known? The object of the body, the object of something else in the room, the object of sound. And rather than tending to another object in this moment, allow the attention to rest in that vehicle of knowing that you've been experiencing. Another way we could say this in this moment is, rather than continuing to tend to what is being seen, Allow the attention to rest as the seer or the knower. From this place of resting as the knower, as the seer, as awareness. What is the difference between these various forms? Aren't they all known the same way? Through the same vehicle of awareness. And aren't they all comprised of the same thing, made of the same consciousness, we could say? If the mind is busy, can move through the same steps with the mind that we just moved through with all of these other objects. Just attend to the mind by noticing, for example, what the mind is busy with, naming that, labeling it, and then rest the attention in the awareness that was aware of the busy mind. Notice how that awareness, that consciousness, is that which not only knows the mind, but animates the mind, makes up the mind. All of these various objects, just different modulations of the same consciousness, the same awareness. If the attention has been like a narrow beam of light falling on these various objects, as you practice this non-practice of resting the attention, allow the beam of light to open and widen. Recognizing that light, as it expands, as not only including all of these various apparent separate forms, but illuminating from the inside. Light illuminating. All things resting in that. Thank you. As Giles mentioned at the beginning of this call, I'd love to have folks join in, and if possible, with by coming on to the screen to chat. But I thought I'd give a little bit more prompting before I open it up, should you find this engaging. So I wanted to walk through this topic of the relative is the absolute a little bit more fully than hopefully we might have just directly experienced in the meditation. When we engage in the distortion that the relative plane is separate from the absolute, that the relative plane is something to transcend, or that it's just an illusion. One of the things that's been interesting me lately is that we ignore the reality of that illusion. So in light of the meditation we just did, we ignore what that illusion is actually made of. So we know various objects, like the object of the breath, through the means, the vehicle, if you will, of awareness. And I think we sometimes forget that that object is made of awareness. So we forget what the illusion is comprised of. We forget how it's known, and we forget by whom. We forget that it's known by awareness itself. So the relative may appear to arise out of the absolute, as waves appear to arise out of the ocean. But like waves, both the relative and the absolute are components of a greater whole. And when we're stuck feeling separate, feeling other than, we're forgetting that. So these things are not separate. When we know ourselves as this whole, which subsumes everything, we cease to diminish or dismiss this mystery of being human. We cease to dismiss the direct experience of our interconnection. And because we're experiencing viscerally that the world is my family, that there isn't a separation. So it's from this recognition, from this understanding, that we see that liberation is not a singular experience. And the reason this interests me so much is I've been quite aware recently of the various ways in myself and in our world that as we move along the path forgetting this, it can be easy to fall into a distortion that the work is ours to do individually. So just to give a little context, when I was training monastically, there's a tremendous amount of attention that was brought to personal process, personal patterns of conditioning. There's so many ways in which how that relates to the collective wasn't tied together. But there can be no individual ego that experiences enlightenment. And we suffer when we forget that. We suffer when we perceive ourselves as separate from the collective on the level of consciousness, the level we've been focusing on so far, as well as that relative level of being connected, recognizing our connectedness to our neighbor. I'd love to pause there to see what kinds of things are arising for folks so far, and then continue on a little bit more. Just curious to see if anyone has any comments so far, whether it be from the meditation or from these prompts that I came into this call with. Any noticings, any observations so far? Happy to continue, just wanted to leave space. Okay. So when we recognize that the world, that all of these various objects, the kinds of objects we explored in this meditation, when we recognize the world as arising in us, in our collective true nature. Remember, true nature is not a singular experience, so our collective true nature, or in awareness, there's nothing to dismiss. So I've been very interested recently in how, on the level of the relative plane and in our situation of privilege, and this arises out of my own explorations of recognizing my own privilege. You know, how do we dismiss injustice or bias or cruelty in the name of transcendence or spiritual understanding? How does what's happening to our neighbor get overlooked in the name of transcendence? And I put transcendence in quotes for obvious reasons, but we can clarify that if you'd like during the discussion. So how do we participate in systems of oppression while ignoring the effects on our neighbor as well as the whole? And do we fall for the story that the awakened life is mine to have rather than ours to be? And within that, what's love got to do with it? So I would love to hear from you. And again, I'd like to pause there, because there's a lot in there that hopefully we'll explore together. Before we do, this is a good moment to pause, and I was invited to remember the importance of announcing that this platform is made possible through donations. And it's actually perfect for this topic. So this topic is recognize, you know, one of the things we're doing in exploring a topic like this is recognizing the reality of the collective. So we're speaking about it on an absolute realm as well as a relative realm. And so on the very relative plane of creating websites and platforms for teachings, please recognize that this particular platform wouldn't exist without your generosity. So thank you in advance for donating and being as generous as you can with Worldwide Insight. Big supporter of this platform, and honored to be here and to be supporting these teachings the way that I can. So thanks for doing your part too. And thanks for your participation. I see this question, Madeline, that you just brought in. Are you speaking to the denial of our shadow elements? Yeah, I'm speaking to the denial of all things on the relative plane. So I'm not seeing how harm is caused in here as separate from how harm is caused with our neighbor or with each other. It's the same process of overlooking truth, we could say, because of a confusion about the nature of our shared being, or the nature of wholeness. So if we're going to go with the topic of shadow, how, for example, can we recognize whatever shadow there is arising in the personality from the same awareness that the shadow itself is made of? That's actually the only way shadow is known. But when we perceive ourselves as other than that shadow, there's a subject-object relationship that comes into being. So now here's shadow, and the perception is, here's me, awareness, or here I am, a separate self, perceiving myself as a separate self that's now in relationship with shadow. So I need to get rid of it, I need to fix it, I need to change it. And for many of us, we're deeply habituated for there to be a tremendous lack of love in that process. And we're doing the same thing, whether it's an internal process, or whether it's with our neighbor, or whether we're ignoring a system, an entire system of oppression, because we're saying that what we need to do in spiritual practice is just move beyond that. But what's been interesting me recently is how in that moving beyond that, we're solidifying something that's not actually real. This apparent, we're solidifying this apparent split, a split that there's an otherness to our experience. And of course there is on the relative plane, right? There is apparent, their forms take different shapes. But when we're coming from the recognition, let's go with that image of the waves in the ocean, for example. When we're coming from that recognition that all of those waves are part of the ocean, arising in the ocean, and actually can't be teased apart from the ocean, then there's room to explore the experience of the vastness of the ocean, what the vastness of this absolute nature of reality. And there's also room to move deeply into the nuances of a wave, exploring deeply, as you point out, Madeline, like exploring shadow. There's no need, just in the way that there's no need to see the wave as separate from the ocean, there's no need to see the absolute realm of experience as separate from the relative. I'm suggesting that they actually aren't separate. Thank you for writing that in, Madeline. I hope you'll expand upon it if that didn't address what you were looking at. Joe, this always happens. When I'm invited to focus on what is aware, I start to look for something. I realize that this is a problem because what's doing the looking is what I'm looking for. Help. What you're recognizing here is important, Joe. You're recognizing the moment that some efforting comes into being, that you recognize as an efforting that's on behalf of this illusion of a separate self, rather than the recognition of awareness itself. notice, even in this moment, that it doesn't require a looking to allow the attention to rest in its source. You don't have to search for anything, for example. So in this very moment, those of you on this call, I invite you to play along with us. In this very moment, just allow, to the best of your ability, allow the attention to rest in its source, which is awareness itself. The attention is so often moving outward from object to object. We're allowing it to rest. Notice that that doesn't require efforting. And rather than seeing it as a problem, that what's doing the looking is what I'm looking for, smile, find the irony in it, and relax into the experience of recognizing that indeed that which you are seeking is causing you to seek. A great book title by Sherry Huber, That Which You Are Seeking is Causing You to Seek. It's only that illusion of a self that perceives itself as separate from life, which begins to panic a little bit in that. But wait, what job is there for me in this? Remember that activity of mind is the activity of mind that's habituated to see this as separate from this, as separate from this, as separate from me. For many of us, our awareness practice ends, if you will, at that point where we see ourselves as that which is aware of other things. If that's where things stop, then it leaves this apparent existence of a something that's in relationship to all of these other things. And when that's the process that's going on, we're not resting in the knowing of our shared being. I hope that felt helpful, Joe. Thank you. Okay, Mike, I see a question. And Joe, feel free to follow up if there's more to explore with that. And again, please come on screen if you can. I know it can be intimidating, but it does allow me to hear more specifics other than just a written question about what you're looking at. But thank you for writing in too. So Mike, if the relative and the absolute are part of a larger whole, what is the absolute? Why do we need a concept of the absolute? Isn't the absolute just the whole of all interconnectedness? Mike, I think what you're pointing to is important. It is in fact, if I'm reading your question correctly, it is in fact exactly what I'm pointing to. Many folks that I work with and talk to get a little stuck perceiving a separation between this absolute realm. For example, the realm that recognizes the non-separate nature of all things. Many folks that I work with get stuck seeing that realm as other than the realm of how race relations are playing out in the United States right now, how structures of oppression are working, how marginalized communities are being oppressed, how whiteness manifests. So from that perception of the two realms being other from each other, I see a lot of folks feeling as though that, you know, for example, I don't know how to embrace the work of owning my own privilege or seeing how whiteness manifests through me, or how all the various ways that I'm seeped in systems of oppression and perpetuate systems of oppression through being seeped in it. Many folks see those two realms as separate from each other. Therefore, there can be a difficulty reconciling the work I was just speaking of with the work of what can be thought of on that absolute realm as personal liberation. But I believe we're pointing to the same thing. It is my experience that the absolute includes all of it. And one of the reasons this topic's alive for me is when I look around at spiritual communities and when I look at my own background and focus, encouraged focus within practice over the years, specifically in a monastic tradition, you know, there was no, just to give some context, you know, there really was no attention brought to, for example, systems of oppression. And it's been a really important part of my own practice and my ongoing work to begin to see how I participate in and am part of such systems, and to see on the relative plane the suffering that's caused, while also attending to what we think of as the absolute. In other words, the way we see ourselves as separate, the way that limitation arises on the absolute realm isn't different from what is happening on the relative. But for many people, it is discussed as if it is. Another thing I've been noticing recently is there tends to be sort of a running in one circle or the other without this recognition of all of it actually being part of the same absolute. We can feel, and our survey shows when you look around that we can be somewhat pigeonholed into one or the other. I was invited to give a Dharma talk recently at a community which I have a tremendous amount of respect for, and like all the folks I've met involved in this Dharma community, very much a lot of respect for them and the sincerity of practice. And I was very aware as I gave the Dharma talk in this setting, I was very aware that I could find a certain level of comfort in this. This was in a Zen center. I could find a certain level of comfort in this Zen center, just based on my own history, my training, and my own whiteness. And I was very aware, as a white man followed the form of walking with a stick through the aisles, and at one point walking behind me, I was very aware that if I were not white, and if I didn't have, if I had trauma around white men with weapons, that would be a deeply triggering experience. Again, this is not to diminish that center. It's not to make anyone wrong. It's to point out what I think historically there's been a lack of attention brought to. And what I'm wanting to engage in conversation about and hear from others about is how might it be possible, when we are recognizing the vastness, the broadness of the absolute, the way in which nothing is excluded on that realm, how then is there no need to continue what often happens in spiritual practice, which is a dismissing of the kind of thing I was just pointing to, trauma, the dismissing of marginalized communities. I saw another circumstance not too long ago in which a white teacher was doing her best to point to the absolute, but in being in conversation with a Black student, it was my concern that the student's experience was made invisible or diminished. And given that historically that person comes from a relative plane in which society diminishes experience and makes invisible, I thought that the means of the teachings actually lacked love. And that brings into the conversation, that last piece that I pointed to. What does love have to do with this? Love is the recognition of our shared being. So to me, love has everything to do with the skillful means in which we are relating to each other on the relative plane around these teachings and around our understandings. Thank you, Mike, very much. Let's see. Okay, I'm reading Joe's comment. We've addressed that one. Thank you. Okay, we've got another comment here. Thanks for clarifying. Let's see if, okay, this is Madeline again. Thanks, Madeline. Thanks for clarifying. Yes, this feels like what I'm studying in my spirituality and social work class. What it sounds like you are speaking to is a shift from the Eurocentric worldview, person to object perspective, which lives in the world, it lives in the world from a context removed from the outer environment, and a shift into the Afrocentric worldview, which relates to life from a person-to-person perspective and understands itself as part of the context in which it exists. I appreciate some of the language you're using with this, Madeline. And I actually also appreciate it. It gives me the opportunity to acknowledge that I am not a scholar. And Madeline, perhaps you can provide continued support through this conversation if you're inspired to point to concepts that you've been studying. I know that you've brought a lot of attention to this. I don't know much about the labels for the different worldviews that hold these perspectives. I'm continually learning, and I'm not by any means an expert. I'm a deep novice. But what I can speak directly from is my experience of watching harm be caused through our inability to reconcile and to recognize the non-separate nature of the absolute and the relative planes of existence. That's just commentary from my own experience, and because I have been learning about systems of oppression and my own being seeped in a societal structure where whiteness manifests in a particular way, I can see that that is a manifestation, that form of splitting in the way that it takes form in this moment in time. I can see that as related to societal structures, not just some sort of internal process, if that makes sense. It was a little bit wordy. I want to see if I can be a touch less verbose about that. The inner process I do of perceiving myself as separate that's a process that the Buddha has been speaking about, and other wise sages have been speaking about for thousands of years. those processes take specific form. The process of the sort of ultimate process of perceiving yourself as separate and therefore suffering takes specific form in our society, in our world. And so that's the specific ways that perception of separation arises in relationship to how this current context of me living in Portland, Oregon, and being part of a system of oppression is what I'm connecting in this moment. Hopefully that clarified. Deborah, you say, the ego clings to separation. How do we love the egoic self? Thank you, Deborah. In my experience, the ego doesn't cling to separation. The ego is the illusion of separation. The ego is the activity of mind. The ego isn't some fixed thing. The ego is the activity of mind that is the perception of separation. So it's not that we have to become some other fixed object that is then going to love that activity of mind. It's possible to recognize that activity of mind is arising in the same vast openness that everything else is. And then, as we see that, we can, through a process of non-judgmental exploring and inquiry, it becomes possible to see that even that activity of mind is comprised of the same awareness that we've been speaking about on this call. And that, in fact, everything is. Everything is comprised of that same awareness or consciousness. Everything is known by that same awareness or consciousness. And that, again, love is the recognition that consciousness is shared, that there is no one or no thing outside it. So the love is what we're resting back into. I'm pointing to love with a capital L that's a primary and fundamental experience, rather than I, a separate self, love you, a separate self, and that's an activity that happens between us. I look forward, Deborah, to seeing if that is clarifying to you. Thank you. Yes, you're welcome. Thank you for writing in. Okay. Sorry, one more question from me. Is your topic directly related to the Buddhist poem, Identity of Relative and Absolute? Becky, I don't know that poem. Oh, it looks like you actually have a comment above that. Let me read that comment first. I don't know that poem, Becky. Perhaps you can find it for us if you think it's relevant to this call. Becky, at a meditation retreat in upstate New York, they had the monks walking around the hall with the stick, which is used to strike you on the shoulders. It sounds brutal, but it's actually used to break up tension, which collects there. Yes, I'm aware of this stick. In the introductory session, they explained what it was and were very clear that some participants may have experienced personal trauma and should not feel any pressure to receive the treatment. In fact, there was a specific way to signal that if you wanted it. Becky, I think what you're pointing to is a beautiful example of how, in that case, the relative plane wasn't dismissed in the name of what might be defined as deeper spiritual understanding. In other words, there's an article floating around right now that many of my Buddhist teacher colleagues are discussing, and it speaks specifically about Zen and inclusivity. And this author is asserting that we don't need to focus so much on inclusivity because Zen historically hasn't, from this person's perspective. That Zen has always been about like discomfort, if you will, and not, this author did not use these words, but, not being warm and fuzzy. And coming from a very strict Zen monastic background, I can agree that there was nothing warm and fuzzy about my monastic experience. But what you're describing, Becky, I think is an interesting example, and I think a good one, of how it's not perhaps necessary to entirely drop a form, especially a form that's been so useful to folks throughout hundreds and hundreds of years. But to recognize that in our current cultural context, if we do want to, if we have a commitment to not have our sanghas be perpetuating context in which there is male domination and in which the group is primarily white, if there's a commitment to that, then there does need to be an acknowledgement of the various doorways in which people are coming into practice. And what I wanted to talk about today is how, when we're not seeing these realms as separate, there's plenty of room for those kinds of conversations to be happening, and that there's nothing getting watered down or diluted, not diluted, but diluted through our attention to such matters. Dawn, because perception equals projection, we are responsible for creating the world we see. This does not discount our experiences. This world is a reflection of the war within. We are in this together. I am my neighbor. We are the change. Thank you, Dawn. It is true that the perception of separation, the kind of separation that's happening in our world and our society is, we could say that as you look around in our world, the whole world is a perfect projection of our conditioned mind, of our own conditioned internal conflict that arises because we perceive ourselves as other than and as separate. So again, rather than holding this apparent split in place and perceiving that liberation is somehow a personal experience that I work out on this absolute realm by consciously transcending all of the split, if you will. I don't know what this was, but this, I mean to put it in quotes, this apparent split of the relative plane, then we're further perpetuating the idea that there is, in fact, a split in a case where there's actually not. So a more simple way we could talk about this, Dawn, is we heal that apparent splitting, that apparent, we heal the ignorance of that apparent split on all levels simultaneously. If we're cutting out one manifestation of how that split happens, well, I'll say this, it's not required to. Now, it's one thing that some teachers just have a great passion for, working on a specific topic, focusing on a specific topic, or working on a specific realm, for example. But what I'm interested in is recognizing it's not required to leave anything or anyone out. Thank you, Dawn. Thanks for writing in. Going back to our comments. Okay, Becky, you've given us a link to the poem. I'm actually not sure. I'm newer to this technology, so I'm not going to click over to a link while I'm on this call, but if you'd like to post the poem there for me to read to the group, I'd be happy to. Thank you for writing in, Becky. Yeah, Dawn, you just said agreed. Thank you. So it could be interesting. Just this can feel a little bit more like engaging of the thinking mind as a conversation than I sometimes invite folks to engage in, and just in the name of keeping it experiential. I invite you on this call to close your eyes for a minute or gaze downward. And I invite you to notice and simply ask, where are the places in my life right now that I'm cutting something out, shutting something out in the name of quote unquote spiritual practice? I'm doing lots of quotes today. That's not why. I think because I really want to point to making sure that I'm clear. That's not what I see as all that's possible for us in spiritual practice. That it's a limitation if we're cutting something out. So just look to see. Are there places in my life that I'm not bringing my greatest understanding, my direct experience of our collective shared being? Are there places that I'm not bringing that experience of connection and love? Are there places that are being excluded? Situations, contexts. Is there an illusion of a separate self that's directing where that love goes, and in that process leaving out specific people, circumstances, experiences, internal or external? As you Just look to see what arises for you as we allow this to be experiential. This is a little note I took right before the call, and you can see if it prompts anything. From the recognition of our oneness, we're not afraid to know the absolute while simultaneously touching the relative, and we don't see them as separate. All being is shared being, and to know that is peace. To live that is love. Thank you. I'd be curious to hear from folks, maybe just a couple words if you would write in. Where did you see anything in that? Where might you be keeping love back, holding back, not bringing your deepest understanding to a specific place in the name of it not being part of your spiritual practice? What do you notice? Becky, I'm just seeing your note now that it's quite long, this poem, so no problem. No problem. For those that are interested in reading this poem, please do after the call. And Becky has provided a link for us. It's in the question and answer section. So another comment. Certainly in the political realm, I've almost given up on trying to understand the other side, and it makes me sad. Becky, I'm so glad you named that. It's a really good example right now. It'd be interesting for me to hear whether folks from different parts of the world other than the United States are feeling the same weight of what's happening in, at least in the United States right now. Most people that I work with are speaking to me at great length about the suffering they're experiencing as they attempt to stay engaged in what's happening in our country. And you're right on point with the topic of this call to me. To me, what becomes sad in my own experience is the way in which I begin to perceive that I need to shut out what's going on in the name of, I just need to go focus on my own spiritual liberation, without recognizing the way in which that, at least in my experience, can feed a story that it's my liberation, that I'm separate, that I can exclude myself, rather than recognizing and dropping into my direct experience of the collective. So the question for me becomes, how can my top priority be to rest in and know deeply the collective? How can I rest in my deepest and greatest understanding of our shared being, and then move through the world from that recognition? What changes as I'm engaged, for example, in our society? What changes when I'm engaged from that deepest understanding, rather than solely being engaged from perhaps my own conditioned anger, which isn't bad or wrong, but perhaps less directly in touch with that deeper recognition. Thank you for writing that in. And yes, thank you. I'm not sure if your name is, how to say your name. I see that it's S-I-W, and I don't want to butcher your name. But yes, you feel it outside the United States too. Folks, these are intense times. And as I engage with social justice work to the best of my ability, to the way that's authentic for me, it's been more important to me than ever before that I'm engaging while deeply grounded in love and my deepest understanding of our interconnection. I was just at a rally yesterday for Patrick Kimmins. Patrick Kimmins was shot by the police in Portland and killed. To be engaged and to be a voice for the various ways that ignorance manifests in our world, but to do so from the deepest understanding of our shared being is, for me right now, the only thing that allows for a continued fuel in movement. I'm struck by how often I see a type of burnout as we attempt to engage in our world. And the burnout, in my experience, comes from the roots of our actions not being the roots of truth, but rather the roots of perhaps our own conditioned reactivity, which again is not bad or wrong. There are plenty of understandable reasons that we are reactive. But moving from our greatest love, from the recognition of our shared being, having our actions arise and be on behalf of that love, that, in my experience, means that we're deeply in touch with something that, a flame that doesn't burn out, a flame that can't be exhausted. Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for those that just chimed in with a thank you. Charlie, yes, in the UK, it's hard to see how we can deal with poverty and homelessness. It seems that the politicians and big businesses have all the power. I couldn't agree more that it can seem that way. And if we're only looking at the relative plane, we have plenty of evidence that it is that way, correct? When we allow ourselves to see the relative and the absolute as not separate, then we recognize that actually love is the greatest power. There is no power greater than that. It is deeply indestructible. You know, the power that the President of the United States has, that is destructible power. That is transient, that is impermanent. But the power of our deepest love and understanding, the power of our deepest direct experience of interconnection, the recognition of our shared being, which is one way of speaking about love with a capital L, that love cannot be exhausted, it cannot be extinguished. And it is who we actually are. Of course, during these times, there's tremendous distortion and there's tremendous forgetting going on. But to react to that forgetting from further forgetting, from the stance of separation, that activity of mind that is separation, won't lead, in my experience, it won't lead to that collective liberation. It continues the game of win, lose, win, lose, win, lose. And the freedom we seek includes that duality, has room for that duality, and is simultaneously beyond that duality. I just recognized that we are in Portland time at 12:31, which means I am a minute over. I'm reading this last question here, and it's beautiful. It's about intimacy, and I am afraid that I since I'm already a minute over, I should probably not go into addressing that question. But Pauline, please feel free to engage with me in another way if you would enjoy that. I do offer private consultations. My website currently says that I'm not taking new students, but if you had a call, it's just my schedule's full. But if you had a question that didn't get it answered or something you'd like to address from this call, I'd be happy to make an exception. So feel free to contact hello@caverlymorgan.org, and my assistant will get back to you and we'll schedule a conversation. I wanted to make just a couple announcements before I close. Again, thank you for your contribution to Worldwide Insight. I really deeply appreciate this platform. And speaking of this platform, I'm doing a month-long online course through Realize Media and Worldwide Insight called Bridge to Happiness. I've done that course through this platform before, and it was incredibly successful. And one of the things that made it so successful is there was a lot of intimacy and engagement with students throughout the month. And so I hope you'll consider joining that course, and it will be, it's going to be in January, and it'll run from January 15th to February 15th. So please look out for that. I also am excited to mention 2 different retreat opportunities that are coming up. Before I do, if you know you're not going to be traveling to the United States for a retreat, then bring me over to where you are. I'd like to get out of the United States right now. But I do have a Caverly Morgan Professional Facebook page and an Instagram page if that interests you as a way of staying in touch. And then if you can come to the United States, Madeline, who's been chiming in during this call, is leading the movement, mindful movement portion of our Awakening to the New Year, a 6-day retreat in Damascus, Oregon, retreat that's happening from December 28th to January 2nd. And the details for that are on caverlymorgan.org. And then I'm delighted that Mark Coleman reached out and invited me to teach with him at Esalen. And Esalen, that retreat is starts January 11th of 2019. And it's on the essential Buddhist teachings on awakening. And there will be 4 different teachers, Lama Pauldron and Joanna Hardy and Mark Coleman and me. We'll be representing various Buddhist pathways, and then all coming together for collective panels, collective shared practice time as well. So I'm very much looking forward to that. I've never been to Esalen in California. And then I can't get off this call without just mentioning Peace in Schools. We have a new video out. Wavecrest Films came up to Portland to interview some of our teen graduates about depression and the experience of mindfulness and how mindfulness has impacted their depression. And that's now on the homepage of peaceinschools.org. So I invite you to check that out as well. And, thank you, Joe, for saying hello, and thank you, and Charlie and Suvi and Kathleen, thank you. Yes, we do miss having you up here in Portland, and Emily, thank you too. And really thank you to all of you on this call. Anyone who knows me knows that this topic is a slightly more engaging of thinking mind than I sometimes put forward in teachings, but I think it's an incredibly important conversation during this time. And hopefully, as you continue to explore this in your own practice, there can be a constant reminder to drop into the heart of awareness and not engage this topic from right and wrong and the mind of duality, but rather to directly experience this conversation about the non-separate nature of the absolute and relative planes of existence, to have your practice be focused, as we did in the meditation, on what it means to dissolve that, or to recognize, there is no someone that dissolves the separation, but to recognize the non-separate nature which dissolves the perception that there are two. All right, thank you so much. I'm just really pleased to be with you all. Much love, many blessings. Thank you for sharing your practice.